What kind of man attempts the impossible not once, not twice, but 4 separate times, each more audacious than the last? This is the almost unbelievable story of a German fighter pilot who didn't just try to escape British captivity. He walked right up to an enemy airfield, climbed into a fighter plane, and nearly flew himself back to Germany. This is the story of Franz von Werra, the only German prisoner of war to successfully escape from Allied hands and make it home during the entire Second World War. September 5th, 1940. The skies over southern England were thick with contrails and the rattle of machine gun fire. The Battle of Britain was at its peak, and every day brought fresh waves of German aircraft crossing the Channel. On this particular afternoon, a young Luftwaffe pilot named Franz von Werra was hunting for his next kill when British Spitfires found him first. His Messerschmitt took hits. The engine coughed black smoke, and suddenly the confident ace was fighting just to stay airborne. He didn't make it. The fighter came down hard in a Kent field, crumpling into the soft earth near Winchet Hill. Von Werra crawled from the wreckage, bruised but alive, and looked up to see British soldiers running toward him. For most men, this would have been the end of their war. For von Werra, it was just the beginning. Now, before we dive into his escape attempts, you need to understand who this man was. Franz von Werra wasn't your typical German officer. Born in Switzerland in 1914 to a family that had noble blood but empty pockets, he'd grown up with more pride than privilege. By the time he joined the Luftwaffe in 1936, he'd developed a personality that his fellow pilots found either magnetic or insufferable, depending on who you asked. He kept a pet lion cub named Simba as his squadron's mascot. He painted his aircraft with flashy designs and told stories that grew taller with each retelling. By the summer of 1940, he'd claimed multiple aerial victories and had become something of a minor celebrity back in Germany. The propaganda machine loved him, but all that swagger meant nothing when he found himself standing in a muddy English field with rifles pointed at his chest. The British took him to Maidstone Barracks first, then moved him to a facility at Trent Park for interrogation. His captors quickly realized they had a problem on their hands. Von Werra wasn't the type to sit quietly and wait out the war. He was restless, defiant, constantly probing for weaknesses in the security around him. Within days, he'd already tried to slip away from a work detail. It failed, but it sent a clear message. This prisoner was going to be trouble. By October, they'd transferred him to a camp at Grisadale Hall in the Lake District, a remote facility surrounded by marshland that the British considered escape-proof. Von Werra took one look at the landscape and started planning anyway. On October 7th, during a supervised walk outside the camp, he and several other prisoners staged a diversion. While guards were distracted by a slow-moving cart and some commotion among the inmates, von Werra vaulted over a stone wall and disappeared into the English countryside. For 5 days, he was a ghost. He hid in barns, crept through fields at night, and avoided roads where Home Guard patrols might spot him. The British launched a massive manhunt. Soldiers, local volunteers, even bloodhounds were brought in to track him down, and they nearly didn't find him. When they finally spotted him on October 12th, he'd buried himself so deep in mud on a hillside that only his face was visible above the ground. He'd camouflaged himself so well that searchers almost walked right past him. Exhausted, half-frozen, and covered in filth, he was dragged back to captivity and thrown into solitary confinement for 3 weeks. Most prisoners would have learned their lesson. Von Werra learned something else. He learned that the British security wasn't perfect, that with the right planning and a bit of luck, escape was possible. So when they moved him again in November to a more secure camp at Swanwick in Derbyshire, he didn't see tighter security. He saw a new opportunity. At Swanwick, von Werra joined an organized escape committee. These weren't amateurs. They were experienced officers who'd been planning their breakout for weeks. Together, they spent a month digging a tunnel out of the camp, working in shifts, hiding the dirt, and timing their progress to avoid detection. By mid-December, the tunnel was complete. Now they just needed the right moment. That moment came on the night of December 20th, 1940. The timing was almost perfect. A Christmas concert was happening in the camp, with prisoners singing carols loud enough to mask any suspicious sounds. Then, as if on cue, German bombers appeared overhead and British anti-aircraft guns opened up, creating even more noise and confusion. Under this cover, 5 prisoners crawled through the tunnel and slipped into the freezing December night. The other 4 were caught within hours, but von Werra had a plan that was so bold, so absurdly confident that it just might work. He wasn't going to hide in barns or trudge through fields hoping to reach the coast. He was going to steal an airplane and fly himself back to occupied Europe. He'd come prepared. Under his prison clothes, he wore his Luftwaffe flying suit. In his pocket, he carried forged identification papers that identified him as Captain Van Lot, a Dutch pilot serving with the Royal Air Force. The forgery was good enough to pass a quick inspection, and von Werra was betting everything that the British wouldn't look too closely at a fellow Allied airman who seemed to be in distress. His first test came at a railway station. Cold, wet, and speaking English with a thick accent, he approached a clerk and spun a story about being separated from his unit. He needed to get to the nearest RAF base, he explained, to rejoin his squadron. The clerk, sympathetic to what he thought was a Dutch ally, helped him. Even the local police, though slightly suspicious of this disheveled foreign pilot, accepted his story and arranged for a car to take him to RAF Hucknall, an operational training base near Nottingham. Think about that for a moment. A German prisoner of war, hours after escaping through a tunnel, was now being driven to a British military airfield by British police who thought they were helping him. The audacity of it is almost hard to believe. At Hucknall, von Werra was introduced to squadron leader Boniface, the duty officer. Now came the real test. Boniface started asking questions. Where was Van Lot stationed? What squadron? Von Werra answered smoothly, claiming he was attached to a bomber unit at Dice in Scotland. He kept his answers vague but confident, the way a real pilot might if he'd just been through a rough experience and wasn't thinking clearly. But Boniface wasn't entirely convinced. Something about this Dutch pilot felt off. His uniform looked strange. His story had small inconsistencies, so Boniface excused himself to make a phone call and verify the details. Von Werra knew immediately that his time was running out. The moment Boniface started checking his story, the whole deception would collapse. He asked to use the restroom, and the second he was out of sight, he bolted. He ran across the airfield in the darkness, his heart pounding, searching for any aircraft that might be ready to fly. And there, sitting on the edge of the tarmac, was a Hawker Hurricane, a single-seat fighter. British, yes, but von Werra was a trained pilot. He knew how to fly. If he could just get it started, he could be airborne in minutes. A mechanic spotted him approaching the aircraft. Von Werra didn't hesitate. He kept up the act, telling the mechanic he was a ferry pilot ordered to take the Hurricane for a test flight to another base. The mechanic, seeing what appeared to be an RAF officer, believed him. He even went to fetch a battery cart to help start the engine. Von Werra climbed into the cockpit. He was moments away from pulling off one of the most brazen escapes in military history. His hands moved over the unfamiliar controls, trying to orient himself quickly. The mechanic was returning with the starter equipment. Just a few more seconds and the engine would roar to life. Then squadron leader Boniface appeared, running across the tarmac with his service revolver drawn. He'd been alerted by base personnel who'd grown suspicious when the strange Dutch pilot suddenly disappeared. Boniface reached the Hurricane, aimed his weapon at the cockpit, and ordered von Werra to get out of the aircraft immediately. For a long moment, von Werra sat there, hands on the controls, so close to freedom he could taste it. Then slowly, he raised his hands and climbed down. The game was over. He'd been caught literally sitting in the cockpit of a stolen fighter, seconds away from escape. The British were stunned. Even as they arrested him, there was a grudging admiration for the sheer nerve of what he'd attempted. This wasn't just an escape attempt. This was a German pilot who'd talked his way onto an enemy airfield and nearly flew off in one of their own planes. The story spread quickly through military channels, and von Werra spent Christmas 1940 back in solitary confinement, this time under much heavier guard. But here's the thing. The British realized they couldn't keep him in England anymore. He was too dangerous, too resourceful, too willing to try anything. So in January 1941, they made the decision to ship him overseas to Canada, far from the front lines and far from any chance of reaching German territory. On January 10th, von Werra boarded a ship in Glasgow along with over 1,000 other German prisoners. The voyage across the Atlantic was cold and miserable, but von Werra's mind was already working on his next move. Canada shared a border with the United States, and America wasn't in the war yet. If he could just reach American soil, he'd be in neutral territory. From there, he might find a way home. The prisoner train left Montreal on January 21st. heading west toward a remote camp in the Canadian interior. Von Werra had enlisted help from fellow prisoners to create a distraction and pry open a window in their compartment. Near Smiths Falls, Ontario, about 30 miles from the St. Lawrence River and the American border, he made his move. As the train slowed, he dove headfirst through the small window and tumbled into the snow. 7 other prisoners tried to follow him that night. All 7 were recaptured, but Von Werra once again vanished into the winter darkness, and this time his absence wasn't noticed until the next afternoon, giving him a massive head start. He trekked through brutal Canadian winter conditions, covering roughly 30 miles on foot. When he reached the frozen St. Lawrence River, he found a small boat and pushed it across the ice and patches of open water. On January 24, 1941, he stepped onto American soil near Ogdensburg, New York. He'd done it. He was free. Von Werra turned himself into local authorities, declaring himself a German prisoner of war who'd escaped from Canada. The Americans were in an awkward position. They weren't at war with Germany yet, and technically Von Werra hadn't committed any violent crimes on U.S. territory. They charged him with illegal entry, but while Canadian and British officials demanded his extradition, the German consulate worked behind the scenes to get him out of the country. Out on bail, Von Werra became a minor celebrity in the local press, telling embellished stories of his adventures. Then, before extradition could be finalized, he was quietly smuggled across the border into Mexico. From there, he traveled through South America, caught a ship to Spain, and finally made his way to Rome. On April 18, 1941, Franz von Werra arrived back in Germany to a hero's welcome. He was the only one, the only German prisoner of war held by Western allies who successfully escaped and made it home during the entire war. Hitler personally awarded him the Knight's Cross. The propaganda machine celebrated him as a symbol of German determination and courage. He was given command of a fighter group and sent to the Eastern Front, where he scored additional victories against Soviet aircraft. But his story doesn't have a happy ending. On October 25, 1941, just months after his triumphant return, Von Werra's aircraft suffered engine failure during a routine flight over the Netherlands. He was forced to ditch into the North Sea. Rescue teams searched, but his body was never recovered. He was 27 years old. The legacy of Franz von Werra lives on not because of his aerial victories or his propaganda value, but because of his absolute refusal to accept captivity. 4 escape attempts. 4 times he risked everything for freedom. 3 times he failed, but he kept trying until he finally succeeded. The image of him sitting in that Hurricane cockpit at Hucknall, seconds from flying himself back to Germany, remains one of the most audacious moments in the history of prisoner of war escapes. His story was later told in the book and film, The One That Got Away, ensuring that future generations would remember the German pilot who nearly stole a British fighter plane and flew it home. It's a reminder that in war, courage and determination don't belong to one side alone. They exist wherever men refuse to give up, even when the odds seem impossible.